Hello, and thank you for watching Global Spotlight, bringing you timely perspectives from around the world. And today we're focusing on two recent, very critical events that have occurred in the Middle East. The explosion which rocked Beirut, Lebanon, as well as the announcement of diplomatic relations between Israel and the UAE. I'm Jim Falk, and joining me today is a good friend, the president of the Middle East Institute, Paul Salam. He's a leading scholar on the region, and I might add that he's the first non-US ambassador to serve in the role as president of the Institute. Full disclosure, I worked there a number of years ago and have the utmost admiration for the organization, and I hope you'll follow the Middle East Institute by going to mei.edu. Paul is the author of a number of books as well as op-ed pieces. And fun fact, he's a musician and a composer of Arabic Brazilian jazz. And at the end of today's conversation, we're going to add one of his compositions called Medina Tuna. Paul, always a pleasure to see you, and thanks for joining us on Global Spotlight.
Jim, thanks for having me. It's good to see you again, even virtually. I hope to be in Dallas soon once this pandemic ebbs. And it's an honor to be on this podcast or broadcast, which, as I've told you before, I think is the best foreign policy broadcast out there. So
well, you're
kudos
very
to you, Jim, and your team.
You're too generous. So, in doing some reading a bit more over the last 2 or 3 days to get ready for our conversation, when you see it all together, you just realize just how tragic not just the explosion was, but what's happened in Beirut over the last 2 years, if not, as you and I were talking about, over a generation. I mean, Beirut has just not had an easy time at it for now almost 25, 30 years. But I know this explosion hit you hard because Lebanon is your home, one of your homes. Just give us, your thoughts and what you've heard from folks and friends that you've talked with.
Well, indeed, it's a very, very horrific event that took place on August 4, the biggest peacetime explosion ever, as far as I understand it. I haven't been able to go back to see the devastation for myself, but of course I know the city well, I know those neighborhoods well. And just looking at the videos and the pictures and talking to so many friends and colleagues, entire neighborhoods of the city have been blown out. The buildings generally are standing, but nothing left of the windows, doors, furniture, you name it. Many people killed, around 200 maybe, some people we know. Many thousands injured, including family members, and 300,000 people unable to go back into their homes before they might be repaired. So really, really a horrific blast. This, as you said, comes at the end of a terrible year for Lebanon, which included the biggest economic collapse in Lebanon's modern history. The economy is at a standstill, is contracting by maybe about 25%. Unemployment and poverty are going through the roof. People's lifelong savings are stuck in the banks, and the banks are not releasing that money. The currency has lost 80% of its value, and so on and so forth. And that's not even mentioning the COVID pandemic, which the whole world is going through. So a very, very very difficult time. We'll talk in a minute about maybe what it means and the politics and economics of it, but I'll just underline that. But I would want to say, Jim, that over the past 10, 20 years, despite deep problems of corruption and governance and real structural problems that the country has, Beirut as a city and Beirut society and culture and pluralism was really was very, very rich and very, very vibrant, despite the complete dysfunction of government. So this blast, which blows away a lot of what was, is additionally harmful. We should also say in this rather long introduction that on the plus side, there has been a popular uprising which started last October and which has gathered steam, and where a big cross-section of the population wants to do away with the old ways and the old rulers and the old oligarchy and really bring about a better future. So there's hope as well. There's despair, but there's also an insistence on a better life.
And that uprising that you made reference to, that really started because of a proposed tax, is that correct, on WhatsApp? Was that
Well,
a catalyst?
that was the technical, thing that broke the camel's back. It was obviously an accumulation of things.
Yeah.
And it was also driven by the beginning of that economic collapse. The population, the economic collapse was beginning
What started
in the
that?
summer.
What started the economic collapse? I mean, I know Lebanon's had problems for decades, but what was sort of the spark that really made things go so badly so quickly?
Well, it was largely a structural reckoning that was going to come sooner or later. You can pick any trigger point, there's always something happening. But the fact of the matter is that the Lebanese financing scheme, as it were, for the last 30 years was that the government would overspend its budget, in other words, carry a deficit. The central bank, with the assistance of private banks in Lebanon, would lend the government money. The banks would receive lucrative or high interest rates from the central bank for doing that. The Lebanese banking system is one of the most capitalized in the world. In other words, there's a lot of money in the Lebanese banking system, partly because the Lebanese diaspora of millions of people around the world are fairly successful, and they often parked a lot of their money in Lebanese banks. Also, the Lebanese banking system was one of the few secret banking systems still around. So one might say some of the shady money also found its way into Lebanese banks, and there's lots of that. In addition, as I said, the central bank, and hence the banks, were offering attractive interest rates. Now that is effectively a kind of I almost want to say, Ponzi scheme, in the sense that as long as billions of dollars continue to be shifted into Lebanese banks, you can finance those high interest rates. But once that new money stops coming in, the chickens come home to roost, and those high interest rates are not payable, and then the cascade of bankruptcies happen. And that's effectively, after 30 years of this, and it's quite miraculous that it lasted so long, the whole house of cards came crashing down to the point that today the government is bankrupt in the sense that it's defaulted on its public debt. It cannot borrow anymore. The central bank is essentially bankrupt. Its books are not balanced. And the private banks are bankrupt, but they are not declaring it because they're not allowing a run on the banks because you can't get your money out. So it's a frozen bankruptcy, and that's where we are today.
Mm. Very, very good explanation. Thank you so much. So shortly after the explosion, some 6 days afterwards, the Prime Minister, Hassan Diab, resigned. So now you have a caretaker government. When will there be new elections?
Well, there could and should be new government separate from new elections. The parliament serves a fixed 4-year term. I mean, in the past, they've extended their own term, and that could happen. But the parliament supposedly sits until 2022. But the Constitution certainly allows, if and when a government resigns, for a process to be put in place for a new government to be nominated and then to receive confidence in a vote of parliament. So that's where we are today. It's up to members of parliament and the president to take the official constitutional steps to begin naming designating a new prime minister. And that new prime minister will have to begin the process of proposing a new government. Obviously, that's a big issue at play today in Lebanon, both domestically as to who might form or be in the next government. And the international community is also now involved. President Macron was in Beirut after the blast. The State Department official David Hale was in Lebanon. So there's also an international aspect to the way forward in Lebanon, because Lebanon absolutely cannot move forward without international help.
You know, it was interesting to see the video of President Emmanuel Macron of France doing a walk around the explosion, the site of the explosion, before really any high-level officials from Lebanon did so. What is the role, could be the role for the United States?
The United States is a major player at several levels, and the crisis is of several levels. Let's break it down a bit. There is the immediate crisis response, the humanitarian aspect. People are, as we said, injured, dead, their homes destroyed. The international community has made it clear that they will move very quickly to help do their best to work with international NGOs and local communities to rebuild those neighborhoods of the city. They
And if
do
I
not
may
want to.
interject, I read that they're thinking about maybe $15 billion as a starting point.
Perhaps there's a number of different numbers being put forward. They do want to, in that emergency relief effort, bypass the Lebanese government, which they have no faith in. So that's sort of the immediate response and reconstruction. The longer term is what was being discussed before this terrible blast, which is the necessary economic and governance reforms that need to be put in place for then Lebanon to engage in serious negotiations with the IMF and to come up with a serious reform or restructuring and rescue package from the IMF. That would require very serious reforms and anti-corruption measures and all kinds of things from the Lebanese governing authorities. As you just mentioned, the current government has resigned and can remain as a caretaker government, but cannot undertake any major initiatives. So anything major will have to be done by a new government. Now, the period we're in now might be a period of wait and see, because for any major political renegotiation to take place in Lebanon, given that Hezbollah is the major player itself and with its allies, they are awaiting the outcomes of the US elections, because certainly the US and its allies are going to be part of whatever it is that's agreed, whether it's through European allies or through Gulf allies. So they're just waiting to see who is going to be on the other side. If it's another Trump administration, that's one thing. If it's a Biden administration, and if it's a Biden administration that's opening up talks with Iran and Tehran, that's a whole different ballgame. So I think on the big stuff, we're a bit of a wait and see moment.
Well, I wish we had more time to talk about Lebanon, but we'll continue our dialogue and have you back as we follow the events. Let's talk about what happened on August 13th. Were you surprised by, one, the decision to establish diplomatic relations between the UAE and Israel, and what about the timing of it?
First of all, yes, I was surprised. It was a very bold, out-of-the-box move. Some would say a risky move. The issue remains a very, very heated issue in the Arab world and the Muslim world. So yes, I was surprised. Obviously, it's well known that Israel and a number of the Gulf countries had, cooperation ongoing on security issues and some economic matters, mainly because of their shared concern about Iran. And that was, ongoing for years. So yes, I was surprised. I think it is a major sort of watershed in Middle Eastern, in the patterns of conflict and cooperation in the Middle East. It is likely to be followed by similar moves, maybe by Bahrain and the Gulf, maybe by Oman. It might be also followed by a similar move by Morocco. And given the fact that the UAE went ahead with it, implies that Saudi Arabia was okay with it and is on the same page, even if they're not ready or able to do the same thing exactly. Now, when you then step back, if the main Gulf countries and Morocco go in this direction, that means you have Morocco, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the main Gulf countries in this alignment. that's a completely different Middle East than the Middle East you and I grew up in. That's a Middle East in which the Arab-Israeli conflict is no longer it's no longer an Arab-Israeli conflict, even though the Israeli-Palestinian conflict remains very, very acute and is greatly impacted by this deal and by future deals that come along. And the Palestinians were shocked and denounced this move. But maybe in a moment we'll maybe talk a little bit about where that leaves the Israel-Palestine and the Palestinian issue.
Let's talk again about the timing of it. I saw or heard Jared Kushner talking to Wolf Blitzer on CNN a few days ago, and the Trump administration took all the credit. It strikes me, and I'm curious about your thoughts on this, that in a sense, Prime Minister of Israel needed a way out of his approach about the annexation of some of the occupied territories in the West Bank. In that, as you said, Israel and the UAE had long established quiet relations, growing relations. So, in short, what role did the Trump administration play in this decision?
Yeah,
Are they justified in taking so much credit?
I would say basically this is a bilateral agreement that was long coming. I don't think the U.S. necessarily was instrumental in moving it out into the open. Having the U.S. cover obviously is part of the deal and part of what both Netanyahu and the Emiratis get out of it, because the U.S. remains the major player. They want to continue to keep it involved. But I would say the major impact the Trump administration had was making the situation in the West Bank so acutely dangerous that it created an opportunity, that it so encouraged Netanyahu to go ahead with the idea of annexation, which, had he not had domestic problems with that plan, he might have gone ahead and done. And once he realized that he wasn't going to be able to go ahead with it, it was something he could sell, for something else, which was the deal with the United Arab Emirates. And for the United Arab Emirates, who wanted to go down this road anyway, to have something to show for it, to say that, well, we didn't do it for free. We did it in exchange for the permanent suspension of Israeli annexation of 30% of the West Bank. That's
is
a
it
big
permanent?
deal.
Is this truly viewed as permanent, or is it more of a pause?
Well, that's, as the wording of many Middle Eastern agreements, it's often left pending. From the Emirati point of view, it's in the agreement. In other words, the agreement includes a pause, and it's in the agreement. So it doesn't mean a pause that will end, in a few weeks or a few months or a few years, and that gives the Emiratis the, legal, legitimate. If the pause is canceled, then they can say, well, our agreement is canceled. Now, will they do that or not is another point. And the word pause allows Netanyahu to say, which is what he needs to say, oh, it's just a pause, I'm still committed to it. So everybody gets the semantics that they can sell to their publics. But yes, it did create the crisis that was encouraged by the Trump administration. It got so bad that it created an opportunity.
A lot more to it than from a quick reading of the headlines. What about the Palestinians? Have they just been pushed out? Do they have any?
Again, I think the Palestinians have been left and not considered as a central concern of an Arab state yet again. The sad reality is the Arab states have not been supporting the Palestinians or doing anything major for the Palestinians for decades. The betrayal is ancient. It's not new. None of the wars that were waged, maybe the 1948 war, but in 1967, Egypt was, trying to close the straits, to put pressure on Israel, and ended up in a war. In 1973, Egypt waged a war against Israel to regain the Egyptian, Sinai Peninsula. and so on and so forth. So sadly, the betrayal is decades long, and you know the evidence of that is look how weak and in such a vulnerable, terrible position the Palestinians have been in vis-a-vis Israel, which obviously enjoyed blanket support from the U.S. For all this time. So the argument that was being put forward that recognition of this kind could be used as leverage, right, to get the the Israelis to do something, is a valid argument. But the fact of the matter is, it certainly wasn't working. The West Bank, I mean, the two-state solution had already been gobbled up by the Israelis. They were about to annex 30% of the West Bank, as well as the the Jordan Valley. The U.S. had adopted the most right-wing sort of Israeli position. So whatever the strategy was, it certainly wasn't working. In this new reality, will they get a better deal or not? Maybe not. Their crisis remains acute.
And a crisis of leadership, which has been the
And
situation.
a crisis of leadership. What I've written in my piece commenting on the agreement is the agreement was a bilateral agreement between two states who have one common interest and want to move on with their lives. The international community and the regional diplomacy should focus on getting the Israelis and Palestinians back to the negotiating table. The fact that we have a pause, hopefully a permanent pause on annexation of 30% of the West Bank, gives hope that maybe negotiations can get back on track again. Maybe a Biden administration could help get the talks back on track again. And one thing I want to emphasize is that all previous attempts at Israeli-Palestinian talks have been with the background of blanket Arab, except for Egypt and Jordan, sort of blanket Arab disengagement and hostility. I would say that has served the hardliners in Israel and the right wing in Israel that says, well, all the Arabs hate us anyway, so if we do peace with the Palestinians, they're also going to hate us. It's going to be terrible. It's a little bit similar of how if you take a very isolationist and hostile position to Iran, for maybe good reasons, given what the Iranian government has been doing, you're alienating also the Iranian public, and you're serving the interests of Iranian right wing and hardliners. So the political effects of isolation have driven the Israeli public into such a dangerous position. So I'm hoping that, again, UAE did this for its own reasons, but if there's more a mood of cooperation and interchange between much of the Arab world and Israel, that might encourage the Israeli public to move more towards the center. Already it allows Netanyahu to move away from the radical right and more towards the center. And we need an Israeli center to be rebuilt. We need a peace camp in Israel to have any hope of a final resolution of the Israel-Palestine conflict. And the two-state solution is the only solution out there. The other two options are permanent apartheid or a non-existent solution, which is the one-state solution, which is not going to happen.
And this is a way, in a sense, it'll build hopefully some confidence. I was struck how, while there was protest around the Arab world, they were relatively muted. Just like when the U.S. moved its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, I expected that there'd be a lot more riots and problems, which did not really occur. So rarely can we strike an optimistic note when we're talking about the Middle East, but perhaps this is a road to a better day. Let's hope so.
Yeah, let's hope so. I mean, the point is, whether you're being optimistic or not, the focus has to be on focusing on rebuilding the Israeli-Palestinian track. That needs to be resolved for the sake of everybody involved in Palestine and Israel, but also for the region as well. Maybe let's not despair that this action has made things more impossible. They were pretty impossible to start with.
You've been very generous with your time, but before I let you go, I'd like to ask you this question. In a Biden administration, where does Iran fit in? Because I assume that there will be an effort to renegotiate the Iran deal, the JCPOA, And so how does that change things, say, with UAE and Saudi Arabia?
I don't think it'll
I'll give you
change.
a minute and a half to answer that question.
All right. I don't think it will change things with Iran, between Iran and the Gulf countries. They're already at a bit of a moment of de-escalation. There's not much conflict between the two. Iran sort of dominates a rather ruined arc of influence through a number of failed or failing states, which includes Yemen, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. Sadly, the Islamic Republic has no plans to withdraw its forces or militias from any of those countries. The Biden administration certainly will re-engage on the nuclear file, and that's necessary, and might be in a position to at least manage and de-escalate some of the conflicts in the countries I've mentioned. Lebanon is in a dire straits. Nobody wants a civil war in Lebanon with Hezbollah, but we could use some robust diplomacy to get to a better place. Certainly in Iraq, if there's a little bit more of accommodation for the interest of the Iraqi government and the Iraqi people, rather than Iraq being a battleground, that would be good. If Yemen could see some relief, that would be good. So it would be sort of managing along the fringes, but not a major game changer. The Islamic Republic is kind of committed to its current sort of deployments. Not much is going to walk it back from that.
Well, it'll be fascinating to see what happens. And fortunately, we have the Middle East Institute at mei.edu to keep up. Hey, before I let you go, last time, introduce Medina Tuna. Tell us about this composition.
This composition is part of a CD. People don't even use the word CD anymore. Compact disc that I released back in 2004. This was the title tune. It's a poem by the wonderful Syrian poet Nizar Qabbani, who lived in Lebanon and Beirut for much of his life, and loved Beirut. And this was a poem about that city. It's called Madinatuna, which means our city. And I put it to music. And that's what the song is about. And I think it's very appropriate that we play it at a time when Beirut, our city, is suffering so terribly.
Well, Paul, thanks so much for joining us. And now let's listen to Medina Tuna.
مدينتنا تظل أثيرة عندي برغم جميع ما فيها. أحب نداء بعدها أزقت عانيها مآذنها كنائسها سكراها نصليها تسامحها تعصبا